Okay, well, we're gonna get going, and I'm excited about today's conversation. As usual, the cannabis industry is always full of hard lefts, hard rights, bumps in the road, and so forth. But it just become used to it. It's just more of the norm than unusual. And I'm excited about today's subject matter, as well as our two participants that'll be walking us through the many moving parts of the legal cannabis side of it. So joining us today from Marijuana Policy Project, or MPP, is Karen O'Keefe. And Karen has been with the organization for a very long time. She heads up the state legislation side, or director of state policies is the actual title. She's been very active since 2004, getting legislation moved on the medical cannabis side in majority of the states, and continues to be active. And in fact, she is coming to us from Ohio, because there's some activity going on there that we're going to be discussing today. And then joining her will be Kevin Caldwell. He's from Louisiana. He joined the organization in December of 2021. He is the Southeast legislation manager. He manages the efforts in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Kansas. I'm excited about the subject matter, very relevant for anybody involved in cannabis. And one of the things I did want to mention is that this is an interactive conversation. So if you do have questions or things that you'd like to share, please put that in the Q&A, and we will address the question or bring up that subject matter. So starting off today is the first kind of question is, what are some of the major updates on recent attempts to restrict or reserve cannabis legislation in the states that drive momentum behind efforts within each state? So I'm going to kick that off to you, Karen.
Yeah, so we've seen an alarming volume of attempts to repeal or roll back legislation to legalize cannabis or medical cannabis in a lot of states, and to increase taxes. These have varied from an attempt in South Dakota to outright repeal the voter-approved medical cannabis law, to measures to increase taxes and to recriminalize a wide array of conduct. In South Dakota, that repeal measure, along with 3 others to gut the medical cannabis law, failed, thankfully. We've also seen a lot of litigation over the past several years to try to disenfranchise voters, to not allow medical cannabis measures to make the ballot. And now in Nebraska, after 70% of voters approved medical cannabis, there is litigation to try to undo and unwind that. There's also legislation in Nebraska that would gut, or there's proposals from lawmakers to amend existing legislation to gut the qualifying conditions. Under the voter-approved measure, doctors can certify cannabis for any condition, and a committee chair that had a bill would gut that. There was also a proposal to do away with almost all forms of cannabis, so you could only have liquids or pills and not actual flower cannabis. I'm in Ohio now, where there was a proposal last year that was defeated that would have gutted the voter-approved initiative. This year, there's a slightly less terrible version. It would regulate intoxicating hemp and have those sales through the dispensaries. So a lot of the industry is supportive, but we are very concerned that this bill also would kind of be death by 1,000 cuts for actually being allowed to possess and use cannabis. It would recriminalize passing a joint, sharing cannabis. You would have to have cannabis that had ever been opened in your trunk. You could not bring cannabis into Ohio from any other state, so you could be interrogated about where you got the cannabis, if you have a receipt or not. And one of the 2 bills, there's one bill that passed the Senate, would ban smoking cannabis anywhere outside, even on your own front porch or backyard. So there's a ton of efforts to just really restrict the freedom there. and in other states. In Montana, one of the most noxious proposals I've seen was that every single adult cannabis consumer would have had to spend $200 and register with the state to get an ID card and have all their purchases tracked, or you'd be a criminal again. So we've really seen a wide array of proposals. So far, none of those have passed, but the Ohio one did pass the Senate and is still very much alive, and the Nebraska legislature is still meeting. So it's been a lot of defense this year.
Yeah, that's interesting. But you had mentioned, Karen, earlier regarding in Ohio, the legislation, there's a little conflict then between hemp and cannabis. Can you kind of touch on that?
Sure. So yeah, I was in an interested party meeting with a House bill sponsor today, and there were a lot of industry representatives. Under existing law in Ohio, I believe, like a lot of places nationwide, hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids can be sold in a wide array of places, but there aren't a lot of regulations in place or enforced for that. So as part of the implementation bill, I guess they would call it, SB 56 and HB 160 would regulate any products that have a certain amount of THC. I want to say it's 2.5 milligrams, but that might not be exactly right, in them as cannabis. So you could no longer have hemp-derived products sold at gas stations or health stores or anywhere else. They would only be able to be sold at licensed, regulated dispensaries. So there's a lot of conflict there between the hemp industry that says we're already legal, we're already operational, and the medical industry that says that, you know, there's issues with underage people having hemp-derived cannabinoids sold to them, and that it should all be under the same location. It's not something that MPP has really been weighing in on. There are plenty of voices on both sides of the debate. We have been weighing in a little more in states where you don't have legalization, where the only access that people have to THC is through hemp-derived cannabinoids, like Texas, where Kevin's been pretty involved.
And
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
And Texas is an interesting case, particularly because we've seen this. You know, they have a very limited low THC medical program, the compassionate use program, and there's been attempts to expand that into a comprehensive program for several sessions. Unsuccessfully, the hemp industry themselves were trying to better regulate themselves to no avail. I mean, to the point that there was not even age gating, where a person was 16 years old could get an intoxicating hemp product. And that has caused a lot of issues. And you look at states that don't have access to medical cannabis, like the Carolinas, for example, and they have access to hemp products, but they're not going through the rigorous testing that one would expect a medical cannabis product to have. And that is something that, of course, has been a thorn in my side, because I don't think it's right that we see people with debilitating conditions taking a product that hasn't gone through the proper laboratory testing. But I guess we can go more into details state by state, because there's both a medical issue with where hemp and traditional cannabis go, and then as well as a social justice aspect, which is, in my opinion, just as important.
Yeah, I guess there's a specific question about going backwards to a particular state, Georgia. Why are we going backwards? But I think that was one of the common themes I'm hearing from your organization, is there seems to be more battling, taking steps backwards than moving things forward. So could you guys kind of touch on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Now, of course, as I prepped for today, I have several states that I wanted to look at. Georgia wasn't one of the ones that I had looked at in detail. But I think what happened throughout, particularly what we would refer to as prohibitionist states, is people were grasping. They wanted access to cannabis products. And what they saw in the aftermath of the 2018 Farm Bill getting implemented, and eventually some would call it a loophole, other people would say it was intentional, but these hemp-derived products became available. And they were, under the letter of the law, they were federally legal. And so you saw in the Carolinas, in Georgia, in Florida, in Tennessee, in Texas, you had all sorts of entrepreneurs jumping into this, into this market. And I don't want to paint all of them with a bad brush, because many of them were very upstanding companies trying to do the right thing. But there was also unscrupulous companies that were following the letter of the federal law, but and that would be both on the producer and on the dispensing side, or the retail side, I should say. And we've seen legislatures across the country limit to where these hemp-derived products can be sold. But I mean, it is, like I said, it does bother me intensely that in a state like Tennessee or North and South Carolina, where there is no effective medical program in place, and so you have people with very serious debilitating issues getting involved with, getting their relief through hemp products. And whereas I think it's specifically medical cannabis, and I think Karen would agree with me here, is one of the most regulated, tested products that are out there for consumption. And I think that there has been a lot of problems. A lot of these are novel cannabinoids as well. We're not talking about the traditional THC or even THCA, a precursor to THC in the growing process. But Delta 8, Delta 10, THCP. I mean, there's a slew of both naturally occurring cannabinoids that are using through a chemical process, getting something that's intoxicating, as well as artificially created cannabinoids. And there's not been a lot of study on these products, whereas there has been a lot of study of traditional THC as we would know it, either in the flower or through other products that are available in both the adult use and medical markets across the country.
Yeah. Karen, do you have anything that?
Yeah, so on the question of why we're seeing more rollbacks, I think part of it is there are states where voters have been approving medical cannabis or legalization where the legislature is incredibly hostile to it. And they have the authority in a lot of those states to amend or repeal voter-approved initiatives. In Montana, the law passed back in 2020. We also saw an attempt to repeal medical cannabis, to gut medical cannabis by the legislature back in 2011. In Ohio, the state Senate had passed a resolution vehemently opposing legalization before it passed that was almost unanimous. In Nebraska, the former governor, who puts a lot of money into other candidates, was vehemently opposed. So a lot of it is just that we're, the states where we've been able to make progress, in some states are extremely hostile, those elected officials are, and not in keeping with their voters. So that has been a reason that we've seen more of this attempt to roll back them. But we actually have also seen some in blue states where the legislatures themselves have passed legalization. Those have been more limited. We've seen attempts at tax increases. In Michigan, where I live, the governor who supports legalization wanted a 32% wholesale hike on cannabis taxes. We also saw a hike that passed. It was a smaller increase from 9 to 12% in Maryland. And we've seen some states, in New Jersey, the Senate president that was pro-legalization proposed a bill to recriminalize people if they bought cannabis that's illegal, which we think that consumers shouldn't be criminalized. It's one thing to criminalize somebody selling it illegally, but the consumer themselves never was before in any legalization state criminalized, and nor should they be. We also saw the governor of New York proposing rolling back, and she supports legalization, provisions that you can't be searched based on the smell of cannabis. And of course, under the Fourth Amendment, if something's not contraband, you are not supposed to be searched if there's not a warrant and probable cause of a crime. So where marijuana is legal, people that work in the industry can smell like cannabis. My hair has the smell of fires if I'm near them, or cannabis for a long time after I'm exposed. So we have seen some of that too, even from people that were supportive, maybe from law enforcement lobby. And for the tax hikes, I think it's more of a states are facing some budget shortages, and they see cannabis as an easy target.
Yeah. Kevin, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but how the rise of synthetic cannabinoid and hemp-driven substances, especially in states without adult use laws, may undermine cannabis reform gains and hinder future progress. Can you kind of talk about that?
Sure, sure. I think it's an important question, because when we look at how the hemp market has grown exponentially, over the last 3 years, it's truly exploded. And and in that free market approach in many states, or very lightly regulated, lots of people were able to get involved with minimal investment. Kind of similar in lines to a person who was trying to open up a brick and mortar business in any other industry. Whereas, yes, there are the cannabis, both adult use and legal medical markets tend to have, it's expensive. There are the permits, the fees, the taxes make it much more challenging. I do not believe that a lot of these novel cannabinoids that have come out was in the original intent of the 28 Farm Bill. We really won't know for sure until this year. And I do believe that we will have a Farm Bill passed this year, and they will, in one way or the other, deal with the hemp market, is my belief. And I touched upon it earlier, but a lot of these more novel and specifically synthetic cannabinoids, we don't know much about how it interacts with the human brain. And of course, in some of these states, there's no age gating. And so you do have cases where teenagers are getting access. They have legal access to these products. And there are a lot of negative consequences that are happening. I think at times, so often in this world, we live with a lot of reefer madness. And I think sometimes it's hard to tell what I'll say is reefer madness and what is more scientifically based. But once again, I said this earlier, I think that, we do have a lot of scientific study on naturally occurring THC. We know what the dangers are, or I think we are much more well versed, let me say, in what the negative consequences are today, and that's why you do not see any state that has legal adult use access to people under 21, and usually in most medical states for minors. There are further steps that a caretaker or a parent would have to take for a minor to have access to medical cannabis. And so, particularly when we look at the rise of negative consequences, one of the first things that always pops into my mind is this the regulated market, or is it the illicit market, or is it the underregulated hemp market? Remember, it was just a few years ago that the popcorn lung issue with vape cartridges. And then eventually what they found out that it was not coming from legal illicit sources, but the illicit market was, I guess for lack of a better word, cutting the product to expand their profitability. And I think that's a lesson we need to be aware of, because I think it is important to learn from our recent history with this. So did that answer your question about novel cannabinoids, or is there an aspect that you'd like me to go deeper into on that?
No, I think they touched on it for myself when what I was thinking of. I'm going to pivot to Karen. Karen, you kind of brought this up a little bit, but can you talk about what the increased taxation proposals out there, in some states, and what the impact that it has on the overall cannabis market? And I know from California, the impact there.
Yeah, so a lot of cannabis businesses are struggling. I know Whitney Economics asked what percent are profitable, and I want to say only 27% or so last year were profitable. Another 23 or so might have been breaking even, and a lot were losing money. So you already have very, very tight margins, very high compliance costs, very high federal taxes, and the competition from the intoxicating hemp market, which can be purchased online or in a lot of states at gas stations, and the illicit market. So it's going to just make what's already a very challenging business all the more challenging and making it less competitive with, in many cases, neighbor states that won't have as high of taxes, and with the illicit market and the intoxicating hemp market. So I'm, as I mentioned, in Ohio for the day, and the governor here had proposed doubling the excise tax from 10 to 20% in addition to the standard sales tax. Right now, Ohio has a lot of competition from Michigan, which has a more mature market, which is actually somewhat oversaturated and has very low prices. So in Ohio, if they doubled the taxes, there would be a lot more people that would be buying their cannabis in Michigan and coming back, and it would just, further devastate, or would devastate, the industry, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we've all seen the overall impact on like the state of California and being able to operate and be legal and compliant versus all the black market competition that's not legal, not compliant. And as Kevin gave a great example of, the products are not always safe that come from the black market. So, Karen, can you touch on any of the updates regarding federal lawmakers and the impact of the current administration appointees on the cannabis reform?
Sure. So when we had the last webinar, we were somewhat hopeful that we could see some progress because President Trump's the first president ever who has said he supports legalization. It said he supports states' rights to make their own laws and safe banking. It has not been a priority in his first 100 days. Other things have been his priority. When it comes to his appointees, we've seen a mixed bag. Both the acting administrator of the DEA and the nominee to be the permanent head of the DEA have not historically been supportive of legalization and have been very opposed to marijuana, I would say. The head of his ONDCP, the drug czar, has said positive things about cannabis, as has RFK, although RFK kind of walked back and said HHS would defer to DEA. We have seen a couple of reports that Trump is pushing behind the scenes, his administration is pushing behind the scenes to at least have safe banking passed by the midterms. And of course, the rescheduling petition is still there. It's the hearings have been paused. A couple of former HHS and DEA folks said that they think if Trump made it a priority, it could get done. So it's very much an open question of if and when these are priorities, and if we see full-fledged movement on them. But in the first 100 days so far, we haven't seen any concrete movement.
Yeah, and again, that just always seems to be the trend for the cannabis industry is there's so many things that'll be pushed over in front of it, even if one it has great momentum. I mean, Safe Banking Act, I think is a great example, great momentum, as well as rescheduling, which I think everyone within the industry was hoping that would continue to move forward, go through its process and so forth. But then other things get put in front of it and just set aside or delayed or even slid back somewhat, which really kind of leads us to, talking about MPP, what your organization, what other similar organizations like you, what have you really been dealing with over the last 4 months? And then what do you see for the balance of the year? And my guess is you have to be somewhat fluid, obviously, when things pop up, like you're in Ohio now, to deal with a bill that got slid in there. So if we could discuss that, that'd be great.
Sure. So yeah, we've done a lot of defense in the past 4 months, but we've also spent a lot of energy working for positive, proactive reforms as well. So certainly all of those threats I mentioned, we've been involved in op-eds, testifying, mobilizing our grassroots, working with allies, meeting with legislators, and otherwise trying to kill rollbacks and tax hikes. On the proactive side, there are 3 states that, we don't think most of these are going to happen this year, but that we think are among the most promising for longer term legalization are Pennsylvania, which could happen this year, Hawaii, and New Hampshire. And so I was in Pennsylvania last week lobbying in Harrisburg on a legalization bill. I think there's a real possibility that it could get done this year, possibly as part of budget negotiations, but it's far from a slam dunk, and it's very complicated by the fact that the bill sponsor in the House wants state-run stores, which I don't think is viable. I think because of federal law, it just won't come to fruition, and I don't think the Senate is amenable to that approach as well. So, first the bill has to get introduced, which should happen soon, and out of the House, and the leader of the House has said that he did expect it to get out of the House this year. And then there's the question of, will the Senate go along with it? And so we help shape those bills, explain our concerns about state-run stores and why we think that due to federal law that could be found preempted, and that there could be a huge slew of other reasons that it's never implemented and thus results in no workable industry. And also pushing for the consumer perspective, making sure that, you don't have people losing their children because they responsibly use cannabis, and having parole and probation revoked, and making sure that there's expungement and release and things like that. There are 203 members of the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania, so there's a lot of lobbying. We have a lobbyist that we just recently brought on. So we're very involved in Hawaii early this year. Unfortunately, there's a very challenging committee process, and both bills end up dying. But we will be working there again next year. And in New Hampshire, there's a bill that passed the House that would just legalize possession. The governor is opposed to full-fledged legalization or any legalization. So it's just an attempt to get that one step forward, and that bill will get a vote on May 1st. And I went there to testify in support of it and to lobby legislators. And we've got some ads running saying that the live-free state shouldn't be a nanny state. It's surrounded by legalization states and has 70% support. So the hope is that at least the Senate will pass it to the governor's desk. And if they don't, having mobilized support will help for eventual passage, which could take a little bit longer. So that's a lot what we do. Also, there's a couple medical bills. Most legislative sessions meet the first 6 months of the year, but Pennsylvania is year-round, as is Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is the state that I think is the most promising for medical cannabis. So I imagine the last half of the year will be pretty involved there to try to help get a workable medical cannabis bill agreed to. Both leaders in both chambers are supportive of the idea, but the Assembly Speaker, Voss, has proposed a completely unworkable model with 5 state stores, which again, we don't think will actually operate, and with a bunch of kind of nanny state where you could only use cannabis in your house, and just a really, really restrictive bill last year. So we're hoping for a more workable approach. And Kevin can talk about what's keeping him busy too.
Sure. We have a couple states targeted. We've targeted South Carolina, of course, for a very long time, and sadly, their legislative session is coming to an end. But it's a 2-year legislative cycle, so we believe that they will be dealing with medical cannabis next year. In addition, I think there's a lot of wait and see. What is going to be the federal policy? Is there going to be any change? We look at states like Texas, and we have been involved. We were very involved 2 years ago in trying to expand their compassionate use, their medical program. Right now, it appears as if a lot of the things that we wanted in 2023 may be part of a compromise package of bills that would severely limit access to consumable hemp products. And, Karen mentioned the fact that we don't normally, it's not basically our lane normally, but what we've seen in Texas, and I'll give you some data, in that famous ACLU report back in 2018, Texas was averaging 70,000 arrests a year for cannabis. We put out a report later that looked at data just using the FBI data on that, which is partial data in both Florida and Texas. But there were still 43,000 arrests in 2019. But in 2023, we were seeing only 23,000 arrests. And I think it was very similar to what we saw in Florida, where the number went down from 42,000 arrests for possession to 3,300. Now, mind you, that's only about 59% of political entities, cities, counties reporting to the FBI. But in both those states, you had access to hemp flower. And so that's part of the rollback that we're seeing is with this banning of hemp flower, which is a priority for the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, who controls the legislative agenda of the Senate. So it's a very, very powerful position, maybe one of the most powerful lieutenant governorships in the nation. But the question is to go from, if they go back to criminalizing hemp products, particularly hemp flower, are we going to go back to 2017 where we're arresting 75,000 people a year? And that is, I think that was one of the things that made us say, hey, let's get involved with this. Let's try to motivate citizens to get in touch with their legislators, because I don't think anybody benefits to going back to criminalizing 75,000 people a year for a natural product. Florida, of course, is a little bit different because literally when the governor allied with the hemp industry, vetoed legislation that would have severely curtailed access to hemp products, and got that industry to help him defeat the legalization ballot initiative from last year. But yet we're still seeing the legislature attempting to severely curtail hemp products. Session still has a few weeks to go. Actually, no, I take that back, about a week to go. But the question is are they going to limit access to hemp products? And if so, are we going to go back to a day where tens of thousands of people are being arrested? Which I think if you're on the cannabis side or the hemp side, I don't think anybody wants to go back to that. And we've been trying our best to let legislators know that the citizens don't want that. So it's there are at the same time we had a bill that slightly expanded medical cannabis access in Arkansas, and I mean literally it would just be, it loosened some regulations on delivery. Particularly under current law, you need to have 2 employees in a van to deliver medical cannabis to a patient, and would have allowed drive-through windows. But I mean that was vetoed by Governor Huckabee Sanders. So she thought that was expanding access too much. And that's something, I mean, that was a pretty minor expansion. But we are keeping our hope alive in the Carolinas for expanding and getting a medical program implemented in both South and North Carolina. We were happy to see in Georgia a bill that expanded their low THC program. Made it through the House, and that will roll over into 2026. And hopefully the Senate embraces that and creates a more comprehensive program. And as I mentioned earlier, part of the slew of bills involved with hemp is expanding the Texas Compassionate Use Program. And there's a Senate bill and a House bill. The House bill is much more comprehensive, in that it would add chronic pain, which is one of the, whereas a clinician would otherwise prescribe an opioid, but it would also allow, when a doctor recommends it as such, to use inhalation, not combustion, but using some form of vaping that would be approved by the regulators of the state. So we have until June 2nd in Texas. So it's going to be an interesting next month to see where all this finally lands out in Texas. But and then, of course, North Carolina, it's interesting. They have an incredibly robust hemp program there. And the Speaker of the House does have ownership in a hemp business. So whether or not we see hemp curtailed like we have been seeing in Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, and Texas. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important that people with debilitating conditions have access to safe laboratory tested products. And I hope that continues to be a major part of the discussion in a lot of these states that we're focusing on expanding medical access to.
Yeah, we have a question from someone that says some of the pushback and limitations, for example, Texas, comes from employers who are concerned about employees under the influence at work. We could do blood alcohol testing, but my understanding or their understanding is similar for THC, that there's no real way to fast and accurate testing. If what are you aware of any efforts to resolve this issue to clear the barrier of legislation?
Let's take that.
Okay.
So I would say all of these laws don't change that employers, not all of these, the Texas law and the status quo don't change employers' ability to fire somebody for testing positive for THC, even though it remains in your system for up to 30 days in your urine. They do have these saliva tests now, which are slightly more recent. They are more like a few days. But again, they don't correspond with impairment. So our suggestion is that employers should not be firing people for the results of drug tests, that they can still do so if they want to, whether it's legal or not in most cases. Some states are restricting that. But in Texas, it's not restricted. But instead, you should be testing somebody's ability to do their job. So there's something called the alert meter by Predictive Safety that was developed after the BP oil disaster to essentially decide, is a person safe to work or not? And the person's tested against their own baseline. And so if a person performs very poorly, it could be from any reason, number of reasons. They could be hungover, they could be sleep deprived. I heard of a guy whose wife had just died and he performed horribly on it and was not safe to work. So the advantage of doing performance-based testing is you find out, are they safe to work? Not, did they use marijuana in the last 30 days, which has nothing to do with your safety for work. So I'd say it's not a concern that I think that employers should have. There are some cases where federal law does require drug testing, even though it's unscientific. And in those cases, employers would have to continue doing so. But I'd strongly urge them to get away from what's in your urine or not, and 20% or so of Americans use cannabis in states, whether it's legal or not. So legalization doesn't make that much of a difference. Those people that are going to go to work impaired probably will do so, whether it's legal or not.
And
There's another.
I'd like to add one caveat to that.
Yep.
And that is the fact that currently employers have the ability, if you are under the influence of pharmaceuticals, that's affecting your ability to do your job. And it's the same way with law enforcement. Law enforcement has drug recognition experts that can tell that a person is under the influence, without necessarily just relying on the THC metabolites that are in their system. And yes, Karen?
Yeah, I just to expand on that more, I think this might be implicit and listeners might have got it, but in case not, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can't be fired just for testing positive for a prescription, but you can be fired or otherwise disciplined for being impaired at work. So this essentially would just treat cannabis the same as every employer is already used to doing for prescription medications, or we would propose instead treating it the same. And there are about half of the medical cannabis laws do say you can't fire somebody just for being a patient. About 8 of the legalization laws either say you can't for metabolites, which stay in your urine, but aren't active use. So that's our recommendation, but most states don't actually have that protection for adult use, and I don't know of any that have it for hemp laws.
And Karen, that's an interesting point because of the proliferation of hemp products now. The number of people that could potentially test positive for THC has grown exponentially.
Yeah. There was just a Supreme Court case where somebody bought what they thought were CBD products and tested positive for THC and is suing because he lost his job as a trucker because he tested positive. So that's another issue with testing too, of if there aren't rules on testing and something's not labeled as having THC, it can have very devastating consequences for people's jobs where they drug test.
And that's why I think rescheduling is so critical. I mean, I think we're at that edge, in my opinion, of critical mass. We have 24 states that have adopted adult use. Virginia, of course, doesn't allow adult sales, but 39 states who have adopted medical cannabis laws. And some of them, of course, are still in the process of being implemented. But I think at a certain point, we can have a states' rights approach to things, but I think we've reached the point where the federal government has to make some logical next steps, whether it goes as far as the States 2.0 Act, which would seem to align with more of what the current administration has spoken of previously, but just the lines of creating some federal guidelines to this, because this is it's not 1984 anymore. And the fact is there are several million patients using medical cannabis. You have, and we're not even going to make a guess as to what the illicit marketplace is. We know that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, hemp market. So millions and millions of Americans are using this. I think it's time that the federal government at least creates some broad parameters, and then from there, hopefully be able to move incrementally from there. I'm not expecting to move everything in one swoop move, but how we regulate hemp could create an avenue as to how we create the cousins of the hemp plant. And I mean, it's all cannabis. We recognize that it comes from the same genus of plants. But, I think at a certain point, we're going to need to move to create some regulations so that businesses and individuals can know that they can comfortably move forward. And that is an important role of government.
Yeah, definitely. And anyway, I'm going to switch. I had a different thought, but I'm going to switch. Someone asked the question, and also kind of takes to another question, but what can the listeners do, as well as other organizations do to help support your efforts? And I know that here at BGM, we're financially supportive, as well as try to do these webinars to get the conversation out there, get people aware of what's happening within the legislation, within the federal and state level and local level activity. So I know that's how we try to participate with your organization. So if you could touch, how can others support that? And then there's a question, or what type of support are you getting from MSOs?
So certainly donations are really important. If people can sign up for a monthly donation of whatever they're able to give. We have had a lot of donors that moved on to other issues. We are getting very, very little industry support. We're so grateful for you. I think we're getting no MSO support at the moment. So, our staff has shrunk considerably in the last few years because there's just not as much philanthropist donation, and we're not seeing much in the way of industry donations. So we really depend on small dollar donors. If you go to a dispensary, if you're in a legal state, you might want to encourage them to support MPP's work as well. And of course, for the advocacy piece, it's really important to plug in. State legislatures don't often hear from that many constituents. Some of them have tiny districts. So make sure that you're signed up to our email alerts, that you're plugged into us on social media, and that, when we ask you to contact your legislator on the bill, consider sending our form letter or editing it, or give them a call, maybe even setting up a meeting in person. If you have a legislator that's particularly opposed or supportive, you can, really create a strong bond if you help with their campaign, if you're supportive of them, or show up in person when they have town halls, because there are not that many people in most states that are engaged at the local level. So make your voice heard, support our work to collectively make our voice heard, and encourage others to support us as well. Kevin, am I missing anything?
No, I think you hit it well, and I think it needs to be reiterated twice, especially particularly state legislators do not hear from a lot of their constituents, and often at the bottom of an alert where we let our readers know what's going on, we'll say, share this email with friends and family in your state, and it really can be amazing if 5 or 6 people reach out to a state legislator. That oftentimes will kind of send up a flag to them of, wait a minute, this is an important issue to people in my community. And Karen also mentioned, not everybody can contribute to a political campaign, but oftentimes the state legislator, what they really appreciate is if you do volunteer to do outreach in the community and participate in town halls. It's a little bit of effort on an advocate side or a business side can go a long way in helping influence a legislator.
And I just add, always be polite and respectful, even if the legislator's on the other side. I have heard from legislators that opposed issues just because they were salty that a constituent called them at 5 in the morning. So some of them give out their home phone numbers when it's the state legislative. So be really careful. A lot of people have evolved on the cannabis issue. When I started working on it, there was 33% support. Now it's 68% support. Remember, lawmakers could change their minds on that. A lot of the assumptions of there being money involved hasn't really been an issue on medical cannabis. Pharma didn't lobby against us. A lot of law enforcement did, but that was about it. So really just, sharing your story in a respectful way. People can change their minds, but if you yell at them, they are more likely to dig in than to change their mind.
Yeah, there's a question from another listener that's just read it. I'm from Nebraska. The legislation bill being brought before the House currently to restrict Delta-8 products has brought a knee-jerk reaction from other state senators who support the legalization of medical cannabis. Do you think it's wise for senators who support legalizing medical cannabis also support the availability of Delta-8, etc., products in a poorly regulated marketplace?
I don't know if it's wise or not, but my suggestion for the policy in a state where you don't have adult use legalization, my preference would be to regulate, not ban intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids. And I believe in Louisiana, it's not Delta-8 so much as Delta-9 that's derived from hemp that's allowed, even in bars and places like that. So I personally, we're not prohibitionists. I'm very reticent to take away products that people are benefiting from and allowed, but certainly you need age gating, you need regulations, you need to make sure that the packaging doesn't apply to minors and that you know what's in it. I'd say, some of these novel synthetic cannabinoids perhaps shouldn't be allowed and stick to Delta-9. So I would prefer not to outright, ban these products, but instead to put in some regulations, especially in states where you don't have a legal market, where otherwise people are going to be going to the completely unregulated illicit market. But in Nebraska, what they really need to also do is get the medical program moving, because there were two different initiatives, one to legalize possession for patients and one to allow and regulate sales. My understanding is the Nebraska Medical Cannabis Commission has no money, has no staff, has no emails. They cannot do their jobs unless the legislature acts to create that authorization for them to have office space and so forth. And so there's a real need for that to happen. And the attorney general and the governor, or the former governor, are pushing on them to do nothing, which essentially is because they're trying to overturn the law in court. And they think the legislature doing something might hurt that case. And it's really disrespectful to patients, to the 70% of voters that approved it. They really need to get that going.
Yeah, and I know I can speak here in Minnesota, the confusion with the hemp products. And to be very honest, I know that the people within the state of Minnesota that are have some of the preparation or producing some of the hemp product, but I see more hemp product from California and Colorado in this marketplace than what I see from anything derived within the state. So it's definitely a gray area and very challenging, I think, for sure in the short run, if not the long run. There's a question here, and I'm very curious about this. It says, why do you think that Gavin Newsom supports banning hemp-derived products?
I can't get into his head. I know,
I
in
didn't even know he
California,
did. So
they do have legal regulated adult use sales. He might have publicly said why he supports banning them, but I'm not sure. But probably some of the concerns that Kevin's mentioned and that we're aware of, that in many cases the labeling is inaccurate on these products. In many cases there is not regulated system, and there's concerns about them being sold in places where they might be sold to children. So it might be related to those things. It might be related to trying to protect the existing adult use cannabis industry too, which is struggling a lot in California.
yeah. I'm going to ask this question. So my question is this discriminatory to refuse pain meds to a patient because of the of THC in drug tests?
Well, it might be discriminatory, but it's probably legal under federal law because the ADA doesn't protect medical cannabis. In MPP's model bill, we say that no one can be denied medical care, including organ transplants, based on legally allowing using medical cannabis. That's made its way into a number of the medical cannabis laws that we helped draft or that were based on ones we helped draft, but not every one. So certainly it's something that we think is wrong. There have been appalling cases where people have died waiting for organ transplants because they were denied the transplant because they didn't and couldn't abstain from cannabis for 6 months because they didn't have 6 months to live. Not because it was an interaction, but because it's federally illegal. So it's a very real problem, both for pain meds and for other medical treatment. And we certainly think, and it's one more reason that we need federal legalization too, and why, rescheduling won't do a whole lot probably. Mostly it will be symbolic, but the symbolism is very important. And it could help with things like the ADA coverage. It's possible, not certain, that once it's federally legal, even if there's no federal access, because it's a long, complicated reason why there won't be, but that perhaps the ADA could apply to cannabis if it was rescheduled.
Yeah, no, I guess I'll speak from a personal comment on that is when my sister was diagnosed with lung cancer at the age of 52, was given 6 months of to live. The challenge within the medical community for her to get a doctor to say, yes, it's okay to try medical marijuana to deal with the pain was significant challenge on her part. It was more, hey, we just need to continue down this path and modify the prescriptions that we are providing. So I do the medical community itself, needs to educate and move forward as well. So I think that's part of it as well as the legalization of medical marijuana.
Yeah, and rescheduling can help with that. Even though it might not make it legal, more doctors might be willing to recommend it if it's not Schedule 1. More medical schools might teach about it if it's not Schedule 1.
Yeah. And I know we answered this, but again, we'll just touch on it. Someone just said, is the present federal government opposed to legalization? And I think you touched on that, Karen, with President Trump being the first.
Yeah, he is the first president to say he supports legalization, at least in Florida. But, the leaders of the House and Senate are not currently supportive at all. So Trump himself, his administration could complete rescheduling. They could stop the federal position that you can't own a gun if you're a cannabis user. They could do some other things on their own. And certainly he has a lot of influence with Congress and with the Senate and could, try to force the issue of full legalization if he wanted to. But as of now, neither leader of either legislative chamber are themselves supportive. Now, maybe it would be more appealing if it was more of a kind of 10th Amendment take, given that that's been a theme of this administration, too, of letting the states make their own decisions about health and policing issues.
Yep. This will be the last question that we'll take. In the state of Alabama, we've been trying to get our medical marijuana program going. But it keeps getting shut down by courts because of lawsuits by the cannabis companies that weren't awarded licenses. Can something be done to stop all the lawsuits?
I'll handle that. Yeah, that's in fact, I have been looking into this immensely because 2 weeks ago, we were very excited that a stay on licensing had been lifted by the courts. However, there was in the ruling, the court looked at how the Alabama Medical Cannabis Commission was supposed to be reviewing companies that were protesting that they didn't get a license. And they wanted to use the basic state law, the Alabama Procurement Process Act. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's APPA. But the recent ruling is that this is not an appellate court. This is a district court that the commission should have been using those guidelines from the get-go. And even though there is a piece of legislation in the legislature, SB 72, that would kind of revamp, add a few more vertically integrated licenses, That was voted out of committee in March. It has not moved at all since then. I do not believe they would have the sun and the moon would have to align perfectly to get the legislature to move on that before their session ends, which I believe is in about a week to 10 days. It's whenever you have a limited licensing scheme, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And oftentimes these companies have put a lot of effort and money into their process to try to get a license. And but at the same time, I will say it breaks my heart working with different patients who have been, were so excited 4 years ago when the medical cannabis bill was passed, and still with no access 4 years, and with this recent court decision, I don't know. I think it could almost be another year before we see licenses get issued, and then from that point, how long before patients get medicine? It's it is heartbreaking because and Karen, she has 20 years experience working with medical patients and advocates trying to get access, and you build personal relationships with these people, and and particularly when we hear of pediatric patients and patients like your sister, people in my family as well kind of brought me into this. So it's we can hope that we can move forward in Alabama. It's but it's going to be a rocky process.
I said that was the last question, but someone brought one, and I'm just curious because I'm not familiar with this. Thoughts on DOJ letter sent to Green Theory in DC?
Yeah, so I don't know enough about it to know for sure. I've seen the basics, which the U.S. attorney in DC sent a letter to a dispensary that I think was based on it being within 1,000 feet of a school, saying they could be shut down. Right now, there is no formal policy of non-enforcement, nor was there. It was repealed under Trump's first term under Jeff Sessions. Before that, there was a memo that I think had something related to children as a time when they could get involved. So I'm not sure if it's a one-off, if it's going to be an issue for any time dispensaries are close to schools or not, if it's coming from just that one U.S. attorney or Maine justice, which would be a bigger problem. So far, we haven't seen anywhere else that it's happened. I don't know if it could be a bigger crackdown, not just within the school zone or just related to the school zone. So it's something to watch very closely. It certainly is concerning. They were allowed under district law. We also saw the Trump administration, the White House issued a list of reasons that they wanted to change things related to DC and said that decriminalization is a disaster in DC. Of course, DC has decriminalized or legalized possession and home cultivation, and they have a medical program, but they don't have regulated stores because Congress won't let them have regulated stores, or it would be much nicer and better regulated.
And I would just like to add one thing to that, Cory, and that is that the DC medical cannabis rules, regulations state that a business can't be 300 feet from a school, whereas the federal anti-drug law, I guess that would be, I don't know what to describe, but their rules is 1,000 feet. So I think that is where Green Theory ran into an issue, as we know of now, because this is something that's like developing over the last 3 days. So, stay in touch, and for that person, they can reach out to me at Caldwell@mpp.org, and I'll try to follow up with them on that.
All right. Well, we're actually running over, but a great conversation, great subject matter. Karen and Kevin, always appreciate your time and knowledge around this subject matter. Hopefully, listeners gain something from it. I definitely think they would or did. And then just to let the listeners know that we will be sending out this recording and contact information. And again, MPP is definitely looking for financial support as well as additional support. So again, Kevin and Karen. Karen, thank you again for your day, and Karen, safe travels and good luck.
Thanks for hosting.